hadn't been in this town long. Just a few weeks, maybe a month if I counted the days I spent staring at the ceiling of my rented room, wondering if I'd made the right decision to leave everything behind. Some people move to a new town for opportunity, others for love, others for adventure. Me? I came here because staying where I was had started to feel like suffocating. A breakup that left me hollow, a job that drained me dry, friends who turned out to be fair weather. It all added up to one thought that rang in my head until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Get out. So I packed what I could fit in my old duffel, drove until my car broke down 2 counties over, and landed here. This small town with one blinking stoplight and a main street that looked like it had been frozen in time 30 years ago. At first, the quiet felt like a kind of peace. No one knew me, no one asked questions. But after a while, silence becomes its own kind of noise. Every night the walls of my room seemed to press closer, and the hum of loneliness got louder. So I did what I told myself I wouldn't. I started going to the local bar. It wasn't much. Wood-paneled walls, pool tables with torn felt, a jukebox that leaned hard into country ballads and classic rock. But it was a place with light, with laughter, with noise that wasn't just in my head. I told myself I'd keep to beer, maybe a whiskey if the night was long. I wasn't looking for trouble. Trouble had a way of finding me, and I'd promised myself this new start would be different. But people in small towns notice new faces, and not everyone greets them with a handshake. That night had been restless from the start. I'd worked a string of odd jobs all week. Unloading trucks, sweeping out a hardware store, anything to keep gas in my car and rent in the landlord's hand. My muscles ached, and my patience was thin. By the time I slid onto the bar stool, ordered a cheap beer, and felt the first sip burn down my throat, I just wanted the world to quiet for a while. That's when he noticed me, the guy who would light the match. Mid-40s maybe, broad shoulders but a belly that spoke of too many nights exactly like this one. His voice carried across the room, thick with liquor and mean laughter. I tried to ignore him. I'd gotten good at ignoring people who wanted a reaction. But he didn't like being ignored. "Hey, city boy," he slurred, loud enough for the whole bar to hear. "What's with that sad puppy face? This ain't no place for moping." I didn't look at him. Just drinking my beer. That should have been enough. But alcohol doesn't let things lie. His boots scraped the floor as he came closer, his shadow falling over me. "You think you're better than us?" he sneered. "Coming in here, sitting all quiet like you own the place?" I felt heat rise in my chest, but I kept my voice level. "I don't think anything. I'm just here for a drink." He laughed, sharp and ugly. "Hear that, boys? He's just here for a drink. Well, so am I. Guess we're drinking together." He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, harder than necessary. That was the shove I didn't ask for. I stood, his hand sliding off, and tried to step aside. Not looking for trouble. But he shoved me back, beer spilling over my fingers. "Looks like trouble found you, stranger." It happened fast after that. Words became shouts, shouts became fists. My knuckles connected with his jaw before I'd even thought it through, and then it was all motion. The crash of a stool toppling, the gasps and cheers of onlookers who always love a fight that isn't theirs. His fist slammed into my ribs, and pain shot up my side. I swung back, half wild, half desperate, and the room blurred into sweat and anger. It wasn't until the door burst open that everything froze. The sound of boots on hardwood, firm and steady. The murmur of the crowd dropping to silence. The fight bled out of me the second I saw the uniform. Cop, no, the cop. The sheriff himself, if the star on his chest was anything to go by. He filled the doorway like he owned it, tall and broad-shouldered, presence sharp enough to cut the air. His gaze swept the room and landed on us. Me with my fists still raised, the drunk with blood on his lip. The crowd parted as he stepped closer. The weight of authority radiated off him, but there was something else, too. A piercing intensity in his eyes, like he was seeing more than fists and spilled beer, like he was seeing me. "Break it up!" His voice rumbled, low but commanding, and just like that, it was over. The drunk staggered back, muttering curses. I lowered my fists, chest heaving, shame already burning at the edges of my anger. The sheriff didn't waste time with questions. He reached for the drunk first, twisting his arm behind his back with practiced ease. Then his eyes flicked back to me, steady, unyielding. "You too," he said, pulling a second pair of cuffs from his belt. I opened my mouth, the words spilling fast. "I didn't start it. He came at me first. You can ask anyone here." The sheriff's expression didn't change. If anything, his gaze narrowed, unreadable. "Doesn't matter. You were fighting. Both of you are coming in." The cold bite of metal circled my wrists before I could protest again. The crowd stayed silent, watching, whispering. Shame churned in my stomach as he guided me toward the door, firm but not rough. Outside, the night air hit me, cool and sharp. The neon sign of the bar buzzed behind us, but all I could focus on was the man leading me to the patrol truck. His hand pressed lightly at my back, steady, and for a fleeting moment I felt something I couldn't name. A pull, a spark, a dangerous awareness. I shoved it down. This was not the time. The drunk was shoved into the back of the truck, still grumbling. I was led to the other side, the sheriff's grip never loosening until I was seated inside. The door shut with a final click that echoed louder than the bar fight ever had. As the engine started and the truck rolled away from the bar, I sat in silence, wrists bound, chest tight. I'd come here to escape the ghosts of my old life. Instead, I was riding into the night with new ones, and the piercing gaze of the sheriff burned in my mind, a presence I couldn't shake. The county jail wasn't much to look at from the outside. A squat brick building tucked behind the courthouse, lit by the kind of dim floodlights that made everything feel lonelier than it was. I'd been in holding cells before, nothing serious, just a stupid college mistake or two. But I braced myself for that same smell of disinfectant and steel bars. Instead, when the sheriff led me through the back entrance, he didn't take me toward the row of cells where I could already hear the other guy cursing and banging on the bars. He steered me down a quieter hallway. His hand hovered at my back, not pushing, not guiding exactly. Just there. Presence. My stomach churned with nerves, but underneath that was something else I didn't want to name. We stopped at a door with frosted glass that read Sheriff's Office. He unlocked it, nodded me inside. The room was warmer than I expected. A desk stacked with papers, the smell of coffee gone cold. A leather chair that looked worn from long nights. A single lamp glowed in the corner, throwing shadows across the walls. No bars. No concrete bench. Just four walls and him. "Sit," he said, motioning to the chair opposite his desk. His tone was clipped, professional, but his eyes lingered too long. I sat, the cuffs biting into my wrists. My pulse was still racing from the fight, but now it beat for another reason. The way he looked at me wasn't the way a sheriff looked at a suspect. It was sharper, heavier, like he was weighing more than the law. He lowered himself into the chair behind the desk, leaned back, studied me. The silence stretched. I shifted in my seat, trying to ignore the way his gaze made my skin heat. "You didn't start it," he said finally. His voice was steady, almost casual, but his eyes never left mine. I blinked. "Then why am I here?" His mouth curved, not quite a smile, not quite a sneer. Something in between. "Because fights have consequences. Doesn't matter who threw the first punch. You were swinging too. That means paperwork, maybe a night in a cell, maybe more." He let the words hang there, heavy as chains. "Unless." The air in the room seemed to shift. My throat tightened. "Unless what?" His gaze dropped briefly to my mouth before flicking back up to my eyes. "Unless you give me something worth letting you go for." I froze. The meaning landed like a punch I hadn't seen coming. My chest tightened with anger, with disbelief, and, traitorously, with something else I couldn't push down. "You're kidding," I said, my voice low. "Do I look like I'm kidding?" His tone was even, almost too calm, which made it worse. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his stare pinning me in place. "One word from me, and this whole thing disappears. No record, no trouble. You walk out tonight. All I ask is a little cooperation." Heat rushed through me. Part fury, part confusion, part desire I didn't want to admit. My fists clenched in the cuffs. You think I'm just gonna roll over because you've got a badge? Because you've got keys to the door? His jaw tightened, a flicker of something, frustration, maybe, crossing his face. He stood slowly, came around the desk, and leaned against it right in front of me. Close enough that I could smell leather and soap, close enough that the authority he carried pressed against me like a physical weight. You've got two choices, he said quietly. Spend the night in a cell, wait for a judge, drag this out, or walk away tonight. Clean. Free. He tilted his head, studying me like a puzzle. What's it worth to you? Anger surged, hot and sharp. I wanted to spit in his face, wanted to tell him exactly where he could shove his proposition. But underneath the fury was a dangerous pull, a memory of how his hand felt against my back, how his eyes had burned into me at the bar. My body betrayed me, tense with rage but humming with awareness. No, I said finally, forcing the word out like it cost me something. His brows rose, faint amusement flickering in his eyes. No, I'm not guilty, and I'm not trading myself just to make your job easier. You want me in a cell, fine. You want me in front of a judge, fine. But I don't play that game. The air between us crackled. His eyes narrowed, but not in anger, not exactly. It was something else, something I couldn't name. He straightened, walked behind me, and for a moment I thought he was going to shove me toward the cells after all. Instead, his hands gripped the cuffs at my wrists. The click of metal unlocking echoed loud in the quiet room. I rubbed at my wrists, skin tingling where the steel had bitten in. He stood over me, silent, watching. You're not afraid of me, he said finally. Not a question. A statement. I met his gaze steady. No, I'm not. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then he stepped back, jaw tight, eyes stormy. Fine, he muttered. We'll do it your way. Papers, judge, the whole deal. He pulled open the door, motioned me out. This time, he didn't touch my back. The heat of his hand was gone, but I still felt it like a ghost. As he led me down the hall toward the cells, I knew one thing for certain. I'd rather face a judge than give him what he wanted on his terms. But the worst part? A small, dangerous part of me wished I had said yes. The next morning, the world felt heavier than my own bruises. I hadn't slept much, hard to rest with the clang of bars and the stink of sweat and bleach surrounding me. The drunk who'd started the fight snored from his cell across the hall, loud and unrepentant, like the night before hadn't even happened. Meanwhile, I lay on a hard cot replaying every second of that encounter in the sheriff's office. His stare, his ultimatum, the heat that burned under my skin even as I told him no. By the time a deputy banged on the bars and said, "Court's in session," I was already exhausted from my own thoughts. The county courthouse sat right next to the jail, a squat building with white pillars that had seen better days. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dust, like history clung to every corner. I was marched into the courtroom, wrists cuffed again, the weight of judgment pressing down before a word was spoken. The drunk was there too, slumped in his chair, his lawyer whispering into his ear while he scratched at his stubble. I didn't have a lawyer, couldn't afford one. They assigned me a public defender who looked younger than me, with nervous eyes and papers spilling out of his folder. The judge, an older woman with sharp glasses perched on her nose, looked at us like she'd seen this show 100 times. And she probably had. Case of public disturbance and assault, she read flatly. 2 individuals brought in after a bar fight. Sheriff's report says both were involved. Witnesses. That word, witnesses, was my lifeline. One by one, people from the bar took the stand. A waitress who'd been serving near where it all began. A guy who'd been playing pool. Even the bartender who looked as tired as I felt. Their stories lined up the same. The drunk started it. He shoved me. He swung first. I only fought back when cornered. Every word that came out of their mouths should have felt like victory. But sitting there with the cuffs biting into my wrists, I felt humiliation more than relief. I shouldn't have been in that chair at all. The sheriff knew I hadn't started it. He'd said as much in his office. And yet he'd dragged me here anyway. Not because of justice. Because he wanted something he had no right to. The judge listened, tapped her pen against her pad, and finally sighed. "Charges dismissed for the defendant," she said, nodding at me. Then she turned to the drunk, who had no defense left after the testimony stacked against him. His charges stuck, and he was led back toward holding, still cursing under his breath. The deputy uncuffed me, and for the first time in what felt like days, I could breathe. But freedom didn't feel the way I thought it would. Outside the courthouse, the sun was blinding. People walked by without giving me a second glance, like I was invisible. I should have been grateful. I should have been relieved. Instead, my chest burned with anger. I thought about the sheriff, about the way his voice had dropped when he said "unless," about the way his eyes had lingered too long, about how he'd unlocked the cuffs not because I'd earned his respect but because I'd refused to bend. He could have ended this before it began. He could have sent me home that night with nothing but bruises. Instead, he chose to wield his authority like a weapon, testing me with it, dangling freedom in front of me like bait. And damn me, but I couldn't shake the memory of his closeness. The warmth of his hand at my back. The way his presence filled the room. Filled me. It made me furious, and it made me restless. I walked for hours that afternoon, through streets that weren't mine, past strangers who didn't know me, trying to put distance between myself and everything I felt. The rational part of me knew I should hate him. I should never look back. Men like him were dangerous, not just because of their badges, but because of the way they blurred the lines between power and desire. But desire doesn't play by rational rules. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his, piercing, unreadable, pulling me toward him even as I pushed away. That night, lying in my rented room, I stared at the ceiling again. This time, the silence wasn't just loneliness. It was confusion. I'd been humiliated, wrongly accused, dragged into court for a fight I hadn't started. I should have walked away with nothing but bitterness. Yet somewhere beneath the anger was a question I couldn't silence. What if? What if he hadn't framed it as a threat? What if it had been a choice from the start? What if the power had been stripped away, leaving only the man underneath the badge? I hated myself for even thinking it, but I couldn't stop. By the time sleep finally claimed me, one truth burned hotter than all the rest. I was free, yes, cleared. No record, no chains. But the sheriff's presence lingered like a brand on my skin. And as much as I wanted to be done with him, I knew deep down I wasn't. Not yet. Freedom should have felt sweet, but in truth it tasted stale. The first few days after court I kept telling myself I'd been given a second chance. A clean slate. No charges, no probation, no record to shadow me into the future. Friends back home who caught wind of what happened called and said the same thing over and over. "You're lucky. Count your blessings. Walk away and don't look back." I tried. God knows I tried. I threw myself into work. The hardware store kept me busy during the day, moving lumber, stacking paint cans, fixing busted locks people brought in. In the evenings I volunteered for extra shifts unloading trucks at the warehouse on the edge of town. Sweat kept my body moving, but it didn't quiet my head. I stopped going to the bar entirely. Just the sight of its neon sign as I drove past made my stomach twist. I told myself it was about avoiding trouble, but the truth was I couldn't stand the thought of looking up and seeing him walk in. Not again. Not when the memory of that office still burned behind my eyelids every time I closed them. At first I managed to keep the thoughts at bay, stuffing them down under exhaustion and routine. But nights have a way of stripping defenses. I'd lie in bed staring at the cracks in the ceiling and feel the pull of memory. His eyes pinning me in place, the weight of his hand at my back, the sharp drop in his voice when he said "unless." It made me angry all over again. The arrogance, the way he thought he could twist the situation to suit himself. But layered beneath the anger was something I hated admitting even to myself. There had been something in his eyes that night. Not just cruelty, not just authority. Something hungry, something lonely. And what scared me most was that part of me had wanted to answer it. That thought haunted me more than the fight, more than the cell, more than the humiliation of being cuffed in front of the whole damn town. Because it meant that even while I'd been furious, even while I'd stood my ground, Some part of me had leaned into that closeness. Some part of me had imagined what would have happened if I'd said yes. I told no one. Not my family when they called to check in. Not the couple of acquaintances I'd made at work who thought I was just another guy trying to get by. Outwardly, I played the part. Grateful, focused, careful to avoid more mistakes. But inside I was tangled in knots. Sometimes I convinced myself he'd only done it out of power, an abuse of authority, plain and simple. That was easier to swallow. It let me keep my anger sharp, my pride intact. Other times, though, usually in the small hours when the world was quiet, I remembered the flicker in his eyes after I refused him. That strange mixture of frustration and what? Respect? Relief? Shame? I didn't know. But it hadn't been simple. Nothing about him had felt simple. That was the part that lingered. The part that pulled at me even when I wanted to hate him. I started taking long walks after work, just to clear my head. Down back roads where cornfields stretched forever, or along the river where the water caught the fading light. Out there, away from people, I could admit things I couldn't say out loud, like how I wanted him. Not as the sheriff, not as the man who tried to intimidate me, but as the man beneath the uniform. The one who, for a fleeting second, had looked at me not like a suspect, but like something he couldn't control. I wanted that man. I wanted him without the cuffs, without the threats, without the power imbalance tilting everything sideways. I wanted to meet his gaze on equal ground and see if the fire between us was real, or just born out of anger and adrenaline. Of course, I told myself it was impossible. We'd never cross paths again, not in any meaningful way. And even if we did, what could come of it? A cop and a man he once tried to coerce? That wasn't the foundation for anything real. So I buried it, or tried to. But late at night, when I rolled onto my side and closed my eyes, the memory of his stare came back, sharp as ever. And in the quiet darkness, with no one to hear, I whispered the truth to myself. I didn't just want him gone. I wanted him closer, close enough to see who he really was when the badge came off. It had been weeks since the trial. Enough time for the bruises on my ribs to fade, but not enough to scrub the memory of the sheriff's office out of my head. I kept myself busy, kept to myself, kept out of trouble. For the most part, it worked. Then one of the guys from the hardware store invited me to a backyard party. Just come by, he'd said, clapping me on the shoulder. Good food, beer, music. Might help you feel like part of the town instead of a ghost passing through. I almost said no. Crowds weren't my thing anymore, and I didn't feel like being the new guy everyone whispered about. But the loneliness had been eating at me, and something in his smile was easy, sincere. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The night was cool when I showed up. String lights hung between trees, paper lanterns swayed in the breeze. A grill smoked in the corner of the yard, and music spilled from someone's old speakers. Classic rock with a twang. People stood in clusters, laughing, drinking, sharing stories about high school football games or county fairs. For once, I felt like maybe I could disappear into the background, blend in. That illusion lasted about 10 minutes. I was leaning against the railing of the porch, a plastic cup in hand, when I felt it, the shift in the air, the way the back of my neck prickled before I even turned. And then I saw him, the sheriff. No uniform this time, just dark jeans, a fitted shirt, sleeves rolled up on strong arms. No badge, no belt, heavy with authority. But the effect on me was the same. My breath caught, my pulse kicked. Our eyes met across the yard, and it was like the courthouse, the cell, the office, all of it collapsed into that one look. His gaze locked on mine, steady, unreadable, but not cold. Not this time. I froze, every muscle tightening, every instinct screaming to leave before he crossed the distance. But I didn't move. He did. He cut through the crowd like it wasn't there, weaving past laughter and smoke until he was in front of me, close enough that the music dimmed under the rush of my heartbeat. Didn't expect to see you here, he said, his voice lower than I remembered. Not the commanding growl of the badge. Softer, almost careful. Trust me, I said, trying to sound steadier than I felt. I didn't expect to see you either. His eyes flicked over my face like he was memorizing it. Then he glanced away, rubbing the back of his neck. It was strange seeing him like this without the shield of authority. He looked almost nervous. "I owe you something," he said finally. His gaze came back to mine, steady again, but this time there was no hard edge. "An apology." I blinked. That was the last thing I'd expected. "You crossed a line," I said flatly. My voice carried more bite than I meant, but I wasn't about to let him rewrite history. He nodded once, no protest. "I did." The words came out heavy, like they cost him something. And I haven't stopped thinking about it since. Something twisted in my chest. Anger, yes, but also a spark of something hotter, something I hadn't been able to shake. "Thinking about what?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "The power trip? Or the fact that I didn't give in?" His jaw tightened, but not in anger. In restraint. "Both," he admitted quietly. "And more than that." I stared at him, caught between fury and the heat crawling up my neck. "You humiliated me. You dragged me into court when you knew I didn't start that fight. And you—" I cut myself off, breath sharp. "I know." His voice broke through, quiet but firm. "I know. I was wrong. Doesn't matter what excuse I give, you didn't deserve that. I thought if I pushed you, I'd get control of something I didn't understand. But you pushed back. And it got under my skin." Hearing him admit it knocked the wind out of me. For weeks I'd built him up into a monster in my head, all arrogance and cruelty. But standing here, stripped of the badge, stripped of the office walls, he wasn't untouchable. He was just a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days, whose eyes carried a weight I recognized all too well. Regret. I swallowed hard. "And now what? You think saying sorry makes it disappear?" "No," he shook his head, stepping closer, though not so close as to corner me. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know I see it. I see what I did. And I can't stop seeing you." The words landed like fire. I should have walked away. I should have turned my back, cut him out of my night, my life, everything. But I didn't. My body wouldn't let me. My chest ached with the anger I'd carried. But beneath it was that same dangerous pull I'd been trying to bury. "You've got a hell of a way of showing interest," I muttered, my voice rougher than I intended. His lips twitched, not a smile, but close. "Yeah," he said. "I know. Not proud of it." He paused, then added almost shyly, "But I'm here now, not as the sheriff. Just me." The heat rose higher, thick in the air between us. I searched his face for the arrogance I'd hated, the power I'd feared, but it wasn't there. Just a man, stripped bare, meeting my gaze like he was waiting for permission to breathe. And damn me, but I wanted him. Still, I forced steel into my voice. "I don't play games. Not with threats, not with power. If that's what this is, I'm out." He shook his head once. "No games, no power, just the truth." His eyes softened, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through. "I want to start over." I didn't answer. Not yet. My pulse was too loud, my thoughts too tangled. But I didn't walk away either. And in that silence, I saw something shift in his shoulders, like the weight he carried might finally be loosening. For the first time since the night of the fight, I saw him not as the sheriff, not as the man behind the badge, but as someone who wanted something real, and was terrified he'd already ruined his chance. I should have turned away, should have let him stand there with his apology and walked off into the crowd. But something in his eyes rooted me to the spot. Not authority, not arrogance, something rawer, something I hadn't expected to see in him. "Can we talk?" he asked, voice low, almost uncertain. I hesitated, staring at him. The sheriff I remembered wouldn't have asked. He would have ordered. But this man, without the badge, without the office walls, looked like he was asking for something more than just a conversation. I gave a short nod. Outside. We slipped past the clusters of people, the music, the smoke of the grill. The night air was cooler, crisp against my skin. Beyond the yard stretched an open field, lit faintly by the glow of lanterns and the sliver of moon overhead. We walked until the noise of the party softened into a distant hum. He shoved his hands into his pockets, shoulders tense. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he let out a slow breath. "You're right," he said. "I crossed a line that night, more than one, and I've been carrying it ever since." I crossed my arms, still wary. "You don't say." He glanced at me, almost like he expected the bite in my tone, then looked away again. "I don't get to explain it away. I know that. But I want you to understand it wasn't just about control. It wasn't about making you feel small." His jaw tightened, words measured. It was desperation. A clumsy, wrong as hell way of acting on something I didn't know how to handle. The breeze stirred, carrying the scent of cut grass. I shifted my weight, trying to decide if I even wanted to hear this. But the truth was I did. He went on. "Wearing this uniform, it's like..." He broke off, searching for words. "You build walls. High ones. You have to. People look to you for order, for discipline. You can't show cracks. You can't let them see what eats at you when you're alone. And me..." His voice dropped. "What eats at me is that I've never been free to want what I want. To want who I want." I looked at him then, really looked. His profile in the moonlight was sharp, but there was something fragile beneath it. His shoulders were broad, but they slumped like the weight he carried had finally bent them. "So that night," he continued, his voice rough, "when I saw you in that fight, saw the way you stood up, the way you wouldn't back down, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in years. It scared me, and instead of being a man about it, I hid behind the badge. I used power to cover up wanting you." The words hit harder than I expected. My first instinct was anger because wanting me didn't excuse what he'd done. But under the anger was a flicker of understanding I didn't want to admit. I'd always been drawn to complicated men. Men with scars they didn't show. Men who carried shadows inside them. Strong, stubborn men who built walls high enough that it felt like a challenge just to glimpse what was behind them. And here he was, walls cracking right in front of me. "You humiliated me," I said quietly, the memory of the office pressing down on me again. "You made me feel like I had no choice." "I know." His voice was steady, but it trembled underneath. "And I hate myself for it. I hate that you saw me like that. I hate that it was your first real picture of me." We stopped walking. The field stretched around us, wide and open. The music from the yard was little more than an echo now. Crickets sang in the grass, the world soft with night. I studied him, my chest tight with conflict. Anger still pulsed through me, but it tangled with empathy, with attraction I couldn't smother. He wasn't the untouchable sheriff now. He was just a man admitting he'd screwed up because he didn't know how to be honest with himself. "Why tell me this?" I asked. He met my eyes. "Because I don't want it to stay that way. Because I haven't stopped thinking about you. Because when you stood up to me, it was the first time in a long damn while I felt something real. And I want the chance to feel that again. Without the badge, without threats, without walls." The silence between us stretched, thick with everything unsaid. I could still hear the echo of his ultimatum in that office, still feel the sting of humiliation. But standing here now, under the night sky, I realized something had shifted. This wasn't about pressure anymore. This wasn't about power. It was about choice. And the choice was mine. I drew in a slow breath, my chest rising with it, and for the first time since that night I let myself admit it, out loud though softly. "I wanted you too, but not like that. Not with chains on my wrists and a deal hanging over my head. I wanted you when I looked into your eyes and saw something more than the sheriff. I wanted the man behind it." His breath hitched almost imperceptibly. His shoulders eased, like some invisible rope had loosened around him. The cool night air wrapped around us, quiet and forgiving. For the first time, it didn't feel like a standoff. It felt like the beginning of something new. The night was still around us, the crickets filling the silence where words faltered. He stood so close I could see the faint crease at the corner of his eyes, the kind that comes from years of squinting in the sun. His hands stayed buried in his pockets, like he was afraid of what they might do if they weren't anchored there. "I don't want to push you," he said, voice low, rough. "Not again. Not ever." His throat worked as he swallowed. But I need to know if I can touch you. If you'll let me. The hesitation in his tone caught me off guard. This was not the man who'd loomed over me in his office, badge heavy on his chest, power dripping from every word. This was a man stripped bare, unsure, asking. My chest tightened. Fear curled in my stomach, old bruises reminding me of how quickly things had spiraled before. But layered over that fear was something else. Something hotter, deeper. Longing. The kind that had kept me awake on too many nights, staring at the ceiling, replaying the way his eyes had burned into mine. I drew in a slow breath. If you try to control me again, I said quietly, I'll walk away. For good. His gaze locked on mine. I won't. And for once I believed him. I nodded, barely. His hands slipped free of his pockets. He moved closer, slow enough that I could stop him if I wanted. But I didn't. Every nerve in my body leaned toward him, aching for the moment we'd both been circling around since that night. When he leaned down, his lips hovered near mine, hesitant, waiting. The pause stretched, and in that fragile breath of space, I realized something I hadn't let myself before. I wanted this. Not out of defiance, not out of anger, not because he demanded it. Because I chose it. I closed the distance. The first brush of his mouth against mine was softer than I expected, almost trembling. It wasn't a claim, it wasn't a command, it was a question. I answered with a pressure of my own, and just like that, the dam between us broke. Heat surged through me as he deepened the kiss, his hand lifting tentatively to the side of my face. The roughness of his palm contrasted with the gentleness of the touch, a silent apology in every stroke of his thumb along my jaw. My hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, not because he forced me but because I couldn't bear the space between us. It was nothing like the charged tension of the station. This kiss wasn't born of power, it was release. Every ounce of anger, shame, attraction, and longing poured into it, mixing until I couldn't tell one from the other. When we finally broke apart, breathless, I leaned my forehead against his. My chest heaved like I'd run miles. God, I whispered half to myself, that feels different. His lips curved into a shadow of a smile. Because it's wanted. The truth of that hit me hard. Wanted. That was the difference. My heart thudded as I realized how much I'd needed that word. Needed this moment. We stood in the hush of the field, the moonlight silvering his profile. He looked younger like this, stripped of armor, eyes shining not with command but with vulnerability. I've hated myself for weeks, he admitted, his voice quiet, for what I did, for the way I let the badge talk for me. I wanted you from the start, but I didn't know how to want you without ruining it. Without ruining me. I searched his face, every line and shadow, and found only honesty there. And you think this fixes it? I asked, though my tone was softer now. No, he shook his head, forehead still pressed to mine. It doesn't fix anything. It just shows you who I am when I'm not hiding. When I'm not afraid. A lump rose in my throat. I hadn't expected this kind of honesty, not from him. But maybe that's why it mattered. I was angry, I said, my voice unsteady. Still am a little. You made me feel powerless. Like my only value was in giving you what you wanted. But the messed up part is, even then I wanted you too. I just wanted it to be my choice. Our choice. His eyes softened, pain flickering there. I wanted you too. From the moment I saw you. And I hated myself for it because it meant showing a part of me I've kept locked away my whole life. Scared me. And I lashed out at the one person who made me feel alive. The silence that followed was heavy but not suffocating. It was the silence of two people finally laying their truths bare, ugly and beautiful all at once. I let out a shaky laugh. We're a damn mess. Yeah, he said, a breath of a chuckle escaping him. But maybe we can be a mess together. I kissed him again, then longer, deeper, surer. This time there was no hesitation, no trembling. Just heat and forgiveness and something that tasted a lot like hope. When we pulled apart, the party lights twinkled faintly in the distance, the sounds of laughter carrying on the breeze. Out here, though, it felt like a different world. One where walls had cracked, where desire didn't have to hide behind threats, where choice made the difference between fear and fire. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time I didn't see the sheriff. I didn't see the man who'd thrown cuffs on my wrists. I saw the man who had been carrying loneliness like a badge heavier than any metal star. And I realized I wanted him, not in spite of the scars, but because of them. Because he was complicated, because he was strong and fragile all at once. Because he made me feel seen in a way that was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The night stretched around us, full of possibility. For the first time, it wasn't about power. It wasn't about pressure. It was about choice, about us choosing each other. The night of the kiss felt like a turning point, but I knew better than to think one kiss could erase everything that had happened. Words mattered now. Choices mattered. So when he asked if we could see each other again, I didn't answer right away. Dinner, I finally said. Somewhere neutral. No uniforms. No shadows hanging over us. He nodded like I'd handed him something fragile. Dinner. Just us. A week later, we sat across from each other in a small-town diner, the kind with vinyl booths and checkered floors. The waitress kept filling our coffee cups while we talked for hours. About nothing. About everything. He told me about the years he'd spent hiding parts of himself behind the badge, about the loneliness of living in half-truths. I told him about the job that had gone sour, the relationship that had ended, the bar fight that had thrown me into his orbit. Walls came down slowly, brick by brick. We weren't sheriff and suspect here. We were two men fumbling our way toward honesty. It didn't stop at one dinner. Another followed, then another. Sometimes it was takeout on my porch, other times it was his cooking, surprisingly good, even if he insisted he wasn't much of a chef. Each time we met, the space between us grew smaller, the conversations deeper. One night, after plates had been cleared and the last of the wine had been poured, silence stretched between us. Not awkward, not heavy. Just full. He leaned closer, his hand brushing mine across the table. I didn't pull away. "Do you want to come over?" he asked, voice steady but low, like he wasn't sure if the invitation would break the fragile trust we'd built. My chest tightened. For weeks, I told myself I wasn't ready, that we needed more time. But sitting there, looking into his eyes, I realized time wasn't the issue anymore. Choice was, and this time it was mine. "Yes," I said. His house was quiet, dimly lit, nothing like the cold walls of the station. We stood in the living room, both of us hovering like we weren't sure who should move first. Then he reached for me, but stopped short, his hand just hovering near my cheek. "Is this okay?" he asked. That simple question undid me. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a threat. It was permission wrapped in tenderness. I took his hand and pressed it to my face. Yes. The kiss that followed wasn't rushed. It was deliberate, slow, like we both knew what it meant to be here, now, stripped of everything but truth. His lips were softer than I remembered, his breath warm against mine. His hands trembled slightly as they slid along my shoulders, down my back, as though he feared I'd vanish if he held me too tightly. We moved together, not out of power or shame, but out of need. Each touch was a question, each sigh an answer. Clothes fell away in pauses between kisses, in laughter muffled by nervousness, in the steady rhythm of trust building moment by moment. When we finally lay together, skin to skin, there was no badge between us, no memory of chains. Only heat and closeness and the steady beat of his heart against mine. He whispered things I don't think he'd ever said out loud before. About desire, about hiding, about the fear that had nearly swallowed him whole. I whispered back, not with promises, but with truth. That I wanted him, here, now, freely. Every sensation was different this time because it was chosen. The weight of his hand, the brush of his mouth, the way his body pressed against mine. It all felt like a language we'd been aching to speak, finally allowed to spill out. When it was over, we stayed tangled together in the sheets, the air heavy with warmth. For the first time since that night in the station, I didn't feel cornered. I felt seen. I felt equal. He lay on his side, fingers tracing idle patterns along my arm. "I don't deserve this," he murmured. I turned to face him. "No, maybe you don't. But neither do I deserve to keep punishing myself by wanting something I'm too scared to take. We both screwed up. But tonight we chose." His eyes softened. "And if I keep choosing you?" I smiled faintly, heart heavy and light all at once. "Then maybe we stop being what we were and start being what we are." Weeks passed. We didn't rush to name it, didn't force it into a box. We just lived it: dinners, long walks, quiet mornings with coffee. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with that same intensity he'd had the night of the fight, but now it didn't make me flinch. Now it made me feel wanted. And slowly, I stopped seeing him as the sheriff who'd cuffed me in front of a crowd. He became the man who laughed too loud at bad jokes, who liked his eggs scrambled but burned, who fell asleep with a hand draped across my chest as though making sure I wouldn't slip away in the night. One evening, as we sat together watching the sun dip behind the fields, I thought back to the night he'd locked me in that room. The memory still stung, but it no longer defined us. "When you locked me in that office," I said quietly, "I hated you." He flinched, but I went on. "But maybe that's where you unlocked something in both of us. You forced me to face what I wanted, and you had to face what you were hiding. Maybe it had to break ugly before it could become real." His hand found mine, fingers lacing gently. No force, no pressure. Just a simple touch, equal and steady. "Real," he echoed, like it was the first time he'd believed it too. And sitting there, with his hand in mine and the sky painted gold and violet, I realized the truth of it. We weren't sheriff and suspect anymore. We weren't enemies locked in a power struggle. We were partners, equals. Two men who had stumbled through fire and come out the other side scarred, yes, but stronger. For the first time, I felt like the story wasn't about what he took from me. It was about what we chose to build together. Love on equal ground.